shepherd's huts are a little bit more traditional in their look, so the wood burning stove and the sort of shabby chic style kitchenette, it's more in keeping with the image, and it really, it probably comes down to a sort of preference of who you're marketing to and the style of your site. Planning considerations are often more difficult for bespoke units because you're having to convince planner of a sort of subjective idea. If it's unique, there are some planners who will be very amenable to it because they think, okay, this is going to be a unique structure of design merit. But inversely, if it's a bespoke structure, they may also not have the kind of the confidence that it would be exactly to plan, etc.
Luke, if you could give one piece of advice to someone when they're considering which kind of glamping unit to buy, what would that be? Hello and welcome to the Glampitect podcast. Today, for the second time, we've got Luke Pica, who he came on a few months ago to talk about his speciality, which is feasibility studies. Now, feasibility study, well, a Glampitect feasibility study is a 20 to 25 page document, and it runs you through everything you need to know to take those first steps into starting a glamping business. So to start with, it looks at your planning probability. You know, it assesses previous glamping planning applications in your area and how the council have dealt with that, and also it assesses local and national policy against your site idea. It also looks at any construction issues you may face. Then it goes on to look at demand and competitor analysis before finally looking at the potential ROI of your investment. So it looks at setup costs, ongoing revenues, profits, and how long it will take to actually repay the initial investment that you put into your site. Then it goes on to look at your next steps that you can take and advises you on those. Today we're going to deep dive into a specific part of the feasibility study. I think it's in the construction section where we talk about recommended manufacturers. And so we send out a fact find form to gather the information for a feasibility study. And usually our clients will have an idea of what kind of glamping unit they want. So they might say they want some glamping pods. So we'll advise them on some potential manufacturer that would be suitable for their project. However, not every client comes into this process knowing what kind of unit they want. There's lots of different styles of glamping unit available. So today we're just going to dig deep into the kind of glamping units that prospective glamping site owners can get on their site. So Luke's got lots of experience in this and how and has an idea of the different kind of figures that you can get. Because it's not just thinking about, you know, what looks nice on my site. It's also thinking about how long you want to be operating for over the year. Think about what nightly rates you can achieve on each style of unit. So there's a lot of considerations going into this decision. So we're going to bring Luke in now to discuss this. So Luke, thanks for coming back on. How you doing?
Really good. Thanks for having me again.
No problem whatsoever. So would you mind just running us through the main styles of glamping units that prospective site owners could look at getting onto their site?
Yeah, well, I think starting with the probably most populous one and maybe most straightforward is bell tents. They are, again, they're very prominent in the south of the UK in particular, where it's a bit more temperate. What we're seeing a lot more of now is obviously glamping pods and shepherd's huts. Shepherd's huts being the more traditional model, glamping pods being the kind of more the upturned boat style wooden pods, which are really gaining popularity now. Additionally, you can find a lot of yurts. There's also safari tents as an option that a lot of people are considering, particularly further south. There's also more unique units that we're seeing now, such as sort of geodesic domes, which are the sort of semi-spherical, sort of hexagonal-looking framed units, which are often clear. Or there's other things such as Hobbit huts even that are often sunk below the ground, like something out of Lord of the Rings. On top of that, there's things like tree houses, and bespoke units are, very ambitious, unique structures, which are, have a much higher reward potentially, but also much higher costs.
Okay, so let's talk about the sort of, I suppose they're a new kid on the block, but they're pretty established now anyway. And that's the glamping pod. I'd say the majority of our clients are looking at setting up glamping pods. They are probably the most popular in terms of the glamping site owners that are coming through the process now. So could you just give us a run through of some sort of the cost estimates, the nightly rate estimates, and the pros and cons of going for glamping pods as your glamping unit of choice?
Yeah, so glamping pods, typically you're looking at a kind of entry level cost of about 16,000, and it can range all the way up to about £45,000 for the most high end, maybe sort of double wide, or with maybe accessible options, accessible bathrooms, etc. Typically, we're looking at about 24 to sort of £26,000 range is probably your average ensuite kitchenette typical glamping pod, which would probably have a double bed and a sofa bed. So you could be looking at 4 berths, 4 adults maximum, but more likely it's 2 adults, 2 children kind of setup. That's the kind of typical industry sort of standard one that I think we'll sort of look at for these purposes. So as far as the kind of advantages, I think, as we said before, these are really desirable units. They are certainly, there's a trend that we're seeing more and more of these units popping up and down the country. They're very Instagrammable, which is huge. They're easy to market. They're also, I think, particularly durable, and they probably require less maintenance than a lot of the sort of lower entry cost units, such as your yurts, bell tents, any sort of tented structure. They're really, you're able to get them straight from the manufacturer, have them delivered directly on site, and you can have them, up and running and plumbed and everything very quickly. And after that, it's really sort of minimal maintenance that goes into them, other than the odd lick of paint. A lot of models provide underfloor heating as well, so they are great units for kind of all weather. You can rent them out all year round with the correct market, and as long as you have people that are willing to rent them, there's really nothing to stop you, rain or shine. Typically, they're en suite, which is a big advantage. Not just in desirability, but also sometimes in planning terms, because as much as other units might have, again, a lower entry cost, the additional sort of planning complications or cost implications of having to put down a toilet block or shower block sometimes just makes the slightly more expensive enclosed unit more attractive. As far as our kind of nightly rates go, I think that at the moment we are seeing a kind of national average of about £130 per night. Post-COVID, it's probably a bit higher than that, frankly. I mean, I think with staycationing just now, we're seeing some glamping pods going for upwards of £225 to £250 a night with the right marketing. But I think realistically, long term, our £130 to £140 is probably a fair nightly estimate for glamping pods. Based on those figures, with a sort of fair occupancy rate of 60% of the year, you're looking at about a 50 to 55% return on investment. But typically for these figures that we're actually talking about today, having 5 units on a fairly standard site, we're looking at about 52% return on investment for glamping pods. As far as disadvantages go, obviously they have a slightly higher entry level cost than some of the cheaper units, and with their sort of size and shape, occasionally there might be slight planning complications over something like a bell tent. But in saying that, more and more councils actually have glamping policies where they sort of lay out exactly and can and cannot be put down. And generally speaking, glamping pods, because of their temporary nature, are considered as temporary structures akin to caravans, etc. So obviously this can't be the case for every council, but many councils see it that way, which does offer typically a fairly decent chance of getting planning permission under many circumstances. So generally, I think these are a really good option. They're cost effective. They get you a decent nightly rate, and they're desirable. So yeah, glamping pods, I think I've got a lot going for them.
Yeah, I think when you talk about desirability, it's important to stress there that that's, it's sort of a double advantage, because one, you bring more guests to your site, but it also allows you to charge a higher rate. There's two aspects to that, and obviously you adjust the rate to match demand as well, so you can balance it out to get the best ROI. And also on the fair occupancy rate, I think it's also important to stress that 60% we'd probably say you'd need good marketing for as well. I think we've done. I think the importance of marketing, it from our perspective, is clear from the fact that we've done about 4 podcast episodes on marketing your glamping site. It's really is crucial. And if you want to get the good occupancy rates, then you're going to have to get your marketing up to scratch, which is what NC 500 Pods did so well, which is why they've got such a good occupancy rate. Especially as we sort of as demand falls a little bit, as trips abroad become more commonplace. I think marketing is massively crucial to a good ROI as well.
The marketing element is obviously applicable to every single kind of unit choice that we're going to have here, and sort of taking advantage of the sort of staycation boom at the moment also allows you to sort of establish a customer base, so that when as you say, people do start venturing abroad again, it's easier to start from a position of strength, when your marketing's better than a lot of the other sites that are maybe taking their market for granted.
Yeah. And as I say, we've done a lot of episodes of marketing, so feel free to go back and listen to those. And I don't want this to be a marketing chat, but in terms of retaining your customer base, I think it's important to say as well that marketing isn't just attracting new guests, it's also retaining existing ones and keeping the customer loyalty going. And by engaging with your previous guests, you're making sure that they're going to come back, staying over and over, and obviously contributing to your return on investment. Moving on to the next unit, I think shares a lot of the pros and a lot of the cons with glamping pods, is the Shepherd Hut, both sort of semi-permanent units that probably fall on the temporary side when it comes to policy. So could you just give us a run through of the sort of overview of Shepherd Huts, please?
Yeah, so the Shepherd Huts are, again, slightly more traditional building, slightly, they're often on wheels. Sometimes they move, sometimes they don't. Again, considered as caravans. These are probably, on average, slightly more expensive than a glamping pod, although you can still get unfurnished ones starting at about 13,000. But typically, you're looking at least a sort of £25,000 kind of starting price for something that's kind of adequate right out the gate. And they can range up to the £60,000-65,000 mark for high-end ones. You can get also double units, maybe where there's 2 Shepherd Huts together, that can be, they have a lovely kind of footprint and stuff like that, offer lots of space, but again, you're probably looking at about £75,000 for one of those kind of really high-end ones. The main things, I think, that the advantages that they have over glamping pods is the form factor of them means that, generally speaking, they will often come with a wood-burning stove. These, rather than, say, underfloor heating, although some Shepherd Huts do also come with underfloor heating, it's just not as typical. I think that's often a sort of stylistic choice, because Shepherd Huts are a little bit more traditional in their look. So the wood-burning stove and the sort of shabby chic style kitchenette is more in keeping with the image, and it really, it probably comes down to a sort of preference of who you're marketing to and the style of your site. But again, they have the same sort of durability, the same sort of desirability as glamping pods. They, more often than not, come with an ensuite. Some Shepherd Huts are a little bit smaller, and they often sacrifice that bathroom, which then requires a toilet block or some other solution, which is always less desirable. It may be that your site already has a toilet block, you're expanding, or it's just not feasible for your site for whatever reason. The slight disadvantages of a shepherd's hut over a glamping pod is typically they don't offer the opportunity to have more than 2 guests. You can get some shepherd's huts that have a small bunk over a double bed, which might allow maybe another 2 additional children to sleep in there. But often, I think that is maybe a little bit cramped. So it really has to be, under the right circumstances that can work. I think typically people expect a standard double bed as really all that a shepherd's hut would offer. So obviously you're potentially halving the number of guests that you could have on site. You might be eliminating some families that could come to glamping pods. But if you're marketing to couples, etc., then shepherd huts have a lot of advantages, and they generally are lovely looking units and traditional to the UK. In a planning sense, that can also be advantageous because a lot of the time shepherd huts are maybe considered to fit the natural form, particularly if it's a rural area or farmland. Some councils have a preference for shepherd huts for that reason. You also will see a lot of traditional shepherd huts that are maybe have been around for a long time being converted and modernised into modern units, which is also quite successful. In terms of the nightly rate, generally they're broadly very similar to glamping pods in what they can achieve. We probably see sort of £125 to £140. And we had a sort of return on investment that's just under glamping pods, given they're a little bit more expensive. So you're looking about the sort of mid 40s to high 40% range of ROI, assuming that, again, under the same circumstances, you're putting down 5 shepherd's huts on the same plot of land that would be sort of typical. And we looked at in the glamping pod example.
Yeah, one thing I'd say on these is, and I put this in quite a lot of the content that I write for Glampitect, is sometimes people come to us and say they don't know whether to go for pods or huts, and I'm not sure whether that's the right sort of mindset, because I personally think, as you said, huts tend to be, accommodate fewer people, and they're a bit cozier almost. And I personally think that if I was looking at a 4 or 5 unit site, I'd go for pods. But if I was looking at a single unit or a couple of units, maybe for couples, then huts would be the way I'd go. So I think they're quite similar, but I personally think they cater to slightly different markets, and that's the way I'd go, depending on what style of site I was after. And the other thing I'd say is, I think if you want to tell a story about your site, which I think again feeds into your marketing and branding, I think whereas glamping pods were created specifically in the last 10-15 years for glamping, whereas shepherd huts have a bit of a history behind them, and less glamorous versions of themselves were used centuries ago by shepherds, for practical use. And so, there's a bit of, if you want to tell a bit of a story about your site, then I think, that can be an easy win as well if you do go for shepherd huts.
Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely.
Yeah. And then moving on to the tented structures, let's start with the sort of entry level one, bell tents.
Yeah, so bell tents, again, these are the sort of, they have a large tent with a single pole in the middle, generally. Look like a very small sort of circus big top. The typically will range from about 4 meters to 6 meters in diameter. The ones that we'll kind of talk about today, because we're looking at a glamping site, will be ones that can accommodate at least 4 people. So you're looking at a kind of double bed and maybe a futon or 2 small futons. Generally, these can start from as little as £500. The more robust variations tend to be at least £1,000 to start, and can range up to about £5,000-6,000 for really high end ones. For sort of comparison purposes, today we'll look at a sort of a £1,000 tent with which would need to be furnished with maybe £500 worth of kind of stove, etc., and maybe another couple of £100 for the bed and the futons, etc. So you're probably looking at about 1,500 to 1,700 for a kind of basic bell tent that would be suitable for a startup glamping site. So the advantages of these, I mean, obviously they have a very low cost, low entry level investment price. They're also quite simple to set up, and they're also easy to move. So these are attractive for people that want to put down a glamping site maybe on a 60-day rule to try out things, or they want to maybe add additional units to a larger site that might already be in operation. Obviously, disadvantages of these things is they require a toilet block and shower block on some level. Possibly you might have a composting toilet, etc. But that's something that needs to be addressed. Obviously, in planning terms, bell tents are normally quite straightforward in that you can just place them. You will still need a change of use if you want to rent out your site for more than 60 days. So you still need planning permission, but typically there'll be less objections to a tented unit rather than anything that's perceived as more permanent, even if they're temporary units like shepherd's huts or glamping pods. But they're nowhere near as robust as those. They're not as weatherproof. Even high-end units can still be excellent in this regard. But generally speaking, you won't see that many bell tent sites that are open 12 months a year. You're more likely to be trading for 8 to 10 months, depending on your geographical location and the sort of nature of your units. They also require quite a flat site. Gradient for glamping sites and for glamping pods and shepherd's huts, obviously you can kind of do some groundwork to adjust the gradient. Bell tents typically are just sort of placed where it's convenient. So there's also the perception with bell tents that, maybe it's if sites are a little bit muddy, etc., that they can be problematic. So you really need to see that your site's suitable, well drained, and temperate enough for it to be worthwhile. But saying that, particularly in the south of the country, they're hugely popular and they can still achieve decent nightly rates. On average, we sort of see bell tents going for about £115 a night, which again sounds great when you're looking at the low entry level of costs. And so with that, you can see a return on investment of about 53%. But again, these units are not as robust. The 53%, I should say, is assuming that we're opening for 8 months a year as well. So if you could achieve a year-round market with them, then your ROI would be even higher. But again, it's very unusual. The British weather is just not normally kind enough to allow that to happen.
Right, and then I imagine safari tents and yurts will be similar sort of pros and cons as well.
Yeah, I would say so. Yurts, very much so. Probably slightly more robust than a bell tent is, but broadly similar considerations. Yurts, again, they're a little bit more of a level of permanence there, so I don't think they're quite as straightforward in planning terms as a bell tent is, but still fairly straightforward. Safari tents, because of their larger footprint, generally speaking, will see more planning issues. Nothing that's insurmountable by any means at all, but it's not as straightforward as a bell tent. Their larger footprint as well means that they're not right for every site. Typically a safari tent, you're looking at a sort of 12 meters by 5 meters, including verandas, etc. So that's, if you have a particularly large site, then you could, these can be really good. Safari tents obviously typically sleep more people as well. So you can normally get a better nightly rate from those. So for yurts, we sort of look at sort of 8 months a year at £120 a night, getting a sort of return on investment of about 41%, whereas a typical yurt probably costs somewhere between £4,000 to £10,000. I think a typical 6-meter yurt that's, again, similar to bell tents that could house a double bed and a couple of futons would cost you probably around £8,500. And then you'd maybe need another £1,000 to fit it out with your wood burning stove and any additional furniture that you would require in there. Whereas your safari tents, typically we're probably looking at £24,000 to £30,000. Again, very similar to glamping pods, but they have the advantage of, with a larger footprint, you can normally have two double beds in there, maybe a bunk bed as well. So you're probably looking at being able to sleep about 6 people So they're better for larger families, larger groups, etc. So again, different market, bit less intimacy, but family market is very strong, particularly in the summer holidays, etc. So the safari tents, I think, we'll be looking at about £160 a night of as an average kind of nightly rate, being available 8 months of the year, and they have a return on investment of about 39%, somewhere around that sort of 40% mark.
Yeah, and so again, similar to shepherd huts, I'd say yurts and safari tents, and particularly yurts, are sort of a bit more conducive to theming. You know, yurts have been in use even longer than shepherd huts. That I think they originated from Mongolian tribes or something. You know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so if you want to tell a story around that, then obviously that's a good start. And also, you see on LinkedIn quite a bit, there's some interesting articles about you know, people who really know their stuff about the glamping industry, and they'll actually argue that the definition of glamping has been muddied a bit by the arrival of shepherd huts and glamping pods, and they'd say true glamping is close to nature in these tented structures, the more temporary structures, and that is real glamping. Obviously, we wouldn't necessarily agree with that definition because the majority of our business comes through pods and huts. But if you are of the opinion that, you know, you want to be the original sort of glamping experience, then I'd say tented structures are conducive to that. But obviously, you've got to consider the other factors as well to that. Moving on to slightly more unusual structures, we've got the Hobbit huts. Obviously, based off Lord of the Rings. If you don't know what hobbits are, then this might confuse you a little bit. So you might have to give a brief definition, Luke. But yeah, so what are Hobbit huts, and what are the pros and cons to them?
Well, Hobbit huts is a kind of term that can be applied to a range of units, and you'll see sort of various kind of different definitions of that, and some sort of wild interpretations. But generally speaking, it's they're essentially similar to glamping pods, but submerged. So they can be side entry or end entry, and with a mound of earth and generally lawn over the top of them. So again, really interesting as far as marketing goes. I think that these, if you're talking about Instagrammability and you know, desirability, they're great units in that regard. But obviously a higher entry level cost, typically because of the additional engineering, excavation costs, insulation, etc., that goes along with these. Looking around, I would say that you can get a sort of decent entry level Hobbit hut for around the £30,000 mark. Some high end ones can hit six figures. I've seen some really nice ones on the market for about 100,000. Advantages of these are pretty similar to pods, to be honest, because again, internally, they offer a lot of the same things. It's really a kind of the external presentation of what you're getting that's different. So you could secure a year-round market with them. They may also suit plus some planners as well, given that having the grass covering them, they might be perceived as having less of an impact on the landscape. That's something that obviously, you know, it can't be broadly across the board in every council, and they don't always necessarily see that way, but it is a clear advantage. As far as the disadvantages go, it's obviously an initial cost, not just in purchasing the units, but also in your groundworks and everything that goes along with that. Another minor disadvantages is maybe no scope for stargazing, etc. So maybe in an area where you're in a dark skies area with really good potential for stargazing at night, a lot of these other units might offer, you know, small windows, things like that, where you can still be cozy and inside and still see what's going on. But obviously, with the Hobbit hut being fully submerged underground, other than your front door, that's not an option that's available to you. Because out there in the UK, from a marketing perspective, I think it's, if you do want to go with something like this, it's easier to stand out in the crowd. And that might be something that's better going forward if we ever do hit saturation in the UK glamping industry.
So the penultimate one we're going to look at is geodesic domes. These we don't. I mean, we have a few people inquiring about these, but they tend to have some planning issues associated with them. So could you just give a quick definition of what they are, and also why we sort of tend to sway people against them, I suppose, with the glamping sites?
Yeah, well, geodesic domes they look like honeycomb style semi-spheres with a sort of plastic scaffolding essentially in hexagon shapes that are then covered often in a sort of clear vinyl essentially. They are very modern looking units, and with that comes the problems. They can look very stylish and slick, and again I think they are very marketable, but especially in rural areas where people are looking to maintain the kind of built form or the style of the landscape, they're often perceived as kind of clashing. So it really is a slightly riskier choice. Mm-hmm. I think the reward for them is actually quite high if you can get planning permission for them, because again, as I said with the Hobbit huts, because they're unusual, I think that they're more marketable. But again, it's a high risk, high reward one. I think typically speaking, you can get domes for around 13,500 that might have a toilet module, a sort of 10 meter sort of diameter one that would be able to comfortably sleep 2 adults with a small kitchenette as well. You'd probably be looking at a sort of similar nightly rate than glamping pods and shepherd huts, so around £130 mark. Typically they're not quite as robust though, so you could probably only rent them out maybe 10 months a year, even if they have the sort of a wood burning stove, etc. in there. That does put them at around a sort of 55 to 60% return on investment, but again, that comes with risks because it is probably one of the unit choices that we see the most objections from planners. Many have been approved, so it's not, again, a foregone conclusion. It's just the general rule of thumb is that there's a slightly higher risk with these units. Additionally, the footprint is slightly larger that's required because they're circular. Generally, your meter square that you need to develop and without corners and edges just makes it a little bit harder to fit circular units, and that can also be said for bell tents and yurts as well. I should have added. So that's another drawback. Not all domes can accommodate toilet modules as well. So depending on the unit choice that you're choosing, you might also still need the solution of for toilets and showering, which can also bring additional planning complications.
Right, and so would you say, as a general rule of thumb, if you are looking at getting these units that maybe have a bigger visual impact on the landscape and therefore a higher risk of planning rejection, would you say that if you are looking at those units, then you would recommend having a site that is well screened by surrounding trees? So if it's really exposed to the surrounding area, then it might not be the way to go. You might be after a more subtle design. But if you are well screened by trees, by whatever it is that's screening your site from view, then you might be well suited to these bigger units.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that good screening is key. And helps pretty much any glamping development that you want to put down. But certainly that you could take more risks with your design choices, the greater the screening opportunity that your site provides. And that could be from the road, from rights of way, or any other means of view in and out of your site. Obviously, when it comes to, say, conservation areas or areas of outstanding natural beauty, for instance, generally speaking, the more traditional form of development, the greater chance you typically have of success. So yeah, screening is really key for these, as is a kind of a forward-thinking planner.
Yeah, and so moving on to the final kind of unit, it's more than just one style of unit, really. We're talking tree houses and bespoke structures that don't really have one set mold, and they, we find that it's difficult to put a definition on these because there's so many possibilities. So could you just give us a quick run through of what kind of units might fit within the bespoke structures definition, and the sort of pros and cons of going for that style of unit?
Well, yeah, anything that's bespoke is obviously going to have a huge variation in the amount of investment. But typically speaking, anything that's bespoke is going to cost you more money than a standard unit that can be mass produced. So right from the get-go, you've got a much higher entry level sort of price barrier to development just in that regard. But I mean, tree houses are probably the closest ones that we see popping up across the UK. You will see various kind of lodges or unique kind of log cabins that are maybe have the same sort of footprint as glamping pods, etc., but would be completely bespoke. Bespoke units can maybe start from as low as this sort of 45, 50,000 pounds and can range up to, the same price as a 3-bedroom semi-detached house. But I mean, typically I think a tree house would be 75,000 to 100,000 pounds. Is probably a likely estimate of what you're looking at. Again, the more unique your unit is, the more marketable it is, and the more desirable it's probably going to be with the right design. The nightly rates that are achievable are often much higher as well. A unique structure that's built for the sort of purposes of your site, for the idea that you have and the story you want to tell, is always going to be easier to market. With that, you can, normally see a high-end unit going for £200 to £225 a night. But with a higher entry level price barrier, you're probably looking at a return on investment of around sort of the 35% mark, based on the kind of figures that we were talking about earlier on. Planning considerations are often more difficult for bespoke units because you're having to convince planner of a sort of subjective idea. It's not, if it's unique, there are some planners who will be very amenable to it because they think, okay, this is going to be a unique structure of design merit. But inversely, if it's a bespoke structure, they may also not have the kind of the confidence that it would be exactly to plan, etc. So that can be problematic. Additionally, particularly with tree houses, you need to erect them in trees, for instance. So they'll often come with a lot of additional surveys that you're going to need to do to be able to site bespoke units. So yeah, and additionally with tree houses, because they have a raised elevation, it makes screening them a little bit more difficult. I think you could pretty much typically say that for a lot of bespoke structures, because more often than not, they have a sort of a higher roof height, might be more prominent in the landscape than a lot of your more conventional and typical glamping units.
Right, and thanks for that. So we've run through most of the styles of glamping units that you could get on your site. I'm sure we've missed a couple, but hopefully that's given a good overview of what you can get. The last question that we usually ask our guests is if they could give one piece of advice on a particular subject, what would that be? Last time, I believe we asked you that question on if they're looking to undertake a feasibility study. Today, obviously, we're going to tailor it to today's subject, and that's picking your glamping unit. So, Luke, if you could give one piece of advice to someone when they're considering which kind of glamping unit to buy, what would that be?
Well, again, I think that going back to something that you said earlier is probably actually really good, in that saying that considering the sort of story that you want to tell, each of these units have their own disadvantages and advantages, and each and every one of them can offer a decent return on investment pretty much across the board. Some might be slightly more and some might be less, but it's really to do with what you want your business to be, and thinking about the type of unit that matches your vision. Now, in some cases, planning may be a barrier to one particular type of unit over another, and you have to consider that. But tailoring it to the type of site that you want it to be is really the best advice I could give you. Be open-minded. Don't commit specifically to one unit, because you may need to alter it through the course of getting planning, etc. But yeah, trying to pick a unit that fits your vision is the way that I would suggest going.
Fantastic. I think that's some great advice. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you to ask you about glamping unit choices or feasibilities, how can they do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could get in touch directly with me at luke@glampitect.co.uk, or contact us directly at Glampitect at contact@glampitect.co.uk, who, if you want to get through to anyone in sales who can provide you with additional advice as well. But obviously, we'd love to hear from everybody. And if you want to find out anything more in depth on these kind of figures and stuff like that, a feasibility study, which is kind of one of my specialities, my department specialities, are a really, really good way to go. Because this is really just like the tip of the iceberg on the kind of figures that we're looking at here, and we have to talk about everything in real generalities. But if you want something that's specifically tailored to your specific site and your idea, then yeah, that's I think a very attractive option for you, and we'd love to help you with that.
Yeah, Luke does a great job of that, and I really would recommend that for anyone in their first step into their glamping journey. We'll actually be, Luke won't be, but I will be, and a few others will be at the glamping show this week. So feel free to come and talk to us about feasibility or plan or whatever it is that you want to know more about. But yeah, Luke, thanks for your time. I'm sure we'll speak again, but yeah, thanks. See you later.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Glampitect podcast. I hope you enjoyed and that you found value in today's episode. If you did, feel free to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as it really helps us move up the podcast rankings. Thank you.